All right, good morning, everybody. I think we are going to go ahead and get started with the event this morning. Welcome to the Gold Dome 2022, which this year is hosted jointly by the Atlanta Press Club and the Georgia First Amendment Foundation. I'm Sarah Brewerton-Palmer, and I chair the First Amendment Foundation's Legislative Committee. I will be moderating the first panel this morning, which will focus on issues relating to the Foundation's mission of protecting and expanding the ability of all Georgians to exercise their right to know what's happening in our democracy, a right that's becoming even more important every year that goes by. The Foundation could not do this critical work without the support of our sponsors, whose generosity funds our mission year-round. So thank you to our major donors, and to our individual donors and our members. Your support gives fuel and meaning to the work that we do throughout the year. I'd like to introduce our panelists for the first discussion this morning. First, Chairwoman Lisa Cupid has led the Cobb County Commission since 2021, and before that she served as a commissioner for 8 years. She is an attorney and a former mediator, a policy analyst, and a manufacturing process engineer. Representative Todd Jones has served in the Georgia House since 2017, representing South Forsyth and North Fulton counties, and he is chairman of the Appropriations Committee, Subcommittee on Education. Representative Margaret Oliver has served on both the Georgia Senate and House, holding her current seat since 2003. She represents her native DeKalb County, and she chairs the House Committee that has oversight of MARTA's budget. Thanks to all three of our panelists for joining us this morning. And we only have 45 minutes for this talk, so let's jump into our discussion. One big piece of news yesterday at the Capitol was the introduction of the Mental Health Parity Act, intended to comprehensively address mental health issues in Georgia. This is a rare bill introduced by Speaker Ralston, and we have his two co-sponsors with us here today. So I definitely wanted to touch on some of those issues with you guys while we have you here. Most of this bill is focused on the challenges of mental health care in the state, but there is some overlap with the mission of GFAF. As I understand, there are some key provisions focused on information gathering and data collection. And Representative Oliver, I'll start with you. Can you tell us about some of those provisions about data collection and sharing information? And if you have any thoughts on how that might interact with Georgia's open records and transparency laws and the role that government transparency and information sharing can play in the context of mental health.
Thank you for this invitation. I'm very pleased to be with you this morning. Parity has been a challenge in funding mental health services since the first federal statute of parity was enacted in 1994. We realize that we are not enforcing the right of any person insured, whether it's Medicaid, government medical care, or private insurance, the right of every person to be treated equally for a mental health illness as well as a physical illness. Historically, I've spent some time looking at access to information on child deaths and child welfare. And in fact, Jane Hansen and I testified in Congress one day about child welfare records. I think that those child welfare records generally are about front page news stories and horrific deaths of children. Data collection on parity, compliance, and enforcement is not going to be as newsworthy, but it is important data to collect for our purposes. I think that the overlap of open records is going to be on the task and accomplishment by the insurance commissioner on his federal and now hopefully mandated task to collect data on mental health services. We cannot know sufficiently, effectively, whether or not the insurance industry is complying with its obligations for parity unless we have the right data. I think there's an overlap in all kinds of data sources. It's not going to be quite as high profile as the issues of child welfare or child deaths. I'm sure Todd can add to that answer.
Sure.
Happy to do so. Oh, I'm sorry.
Oh, yeah, I was going to ask you, to address what Representative Oliver said, and also to give us sort of your perspective on how you think about government transparency when you're drafting a bill like this and as it works through the process.
Sure, happy to do so. I want to reiterate what Chairwoman Oliver said. Thank you very much for the invitation. Looking forward to working with Chairwoman Oliver on this very important legislation. Just a couple of things on the data and the transparency. A lot of the data that's going to be collected vis-a-vis this bill is effectively the same type of data that we're already collecting. A lot of it, though, as you can probably imagine, is what's called PII, and that's personal information that is typically outside of the realm of an open records request just because of the personal nature of that information a lot, and we all call it medical information. But I think what you're going to see is you're going to see a lot of different ways to aggregate this data. So we're going to be able to not just benchmark against the bill, we're going to be able to benchmark hopefully against other states. What our goal is to be the best. And the only way you can be that is to really do a objective measurement against what you wanted to be based on what the bill aspires us to get to. And then also what are other states, what are other entities doing in order to provide mental health services at the highest level? The only way we can do that is through that aggregation of data. So my hunch is, and again, probably there's going to be a little bit what I'll call around the edges. Most of the open records requests will most likely be told, look, we're not going to be able to give you specific PII or personal information, but aggregate data, there's a good chance we'd be able to provide that aggregate data through an open records request.
That's great. And I think we've seen a lot of the utility of aggregate data like that in the COVID pandemic.
Yep, exactly.
Been illustrative of that. We have a lot of topics to cover today. So I want to switch to something that is top of mind for a lot of folks, and that's cityhood initiatives. There's a lot of those on the docket this year, both in Cobb County and in Buckhead. I believe there's 4 different cityhood initiatives in Cobb County. You can correct me, Chairwoman Cupid, if I'm wrong about that. So let's start with you, Lisa. Those Cobb cityhood initiatives obviously are a big focus for you and for the Cobb County Commission. Can you tell us about your perspective on the cityhood process and how government transparency plays into both the process of trying to form a new city and also how that creation of new cities might impact government transparency going forward?
Certainly, and thank you for having me here this morning. As you shared, we do have 4 cityhood initiatives in Cobb County, and these initiatives are grassroots driven. And so they're can originate in many different forms. And there have been questions from citizens as to how information is being shared, because based off of how those who are starting this process decide to meet and share that information can cause a lot of variation in what information the public gets. Also, the persons that may be starting this initiative may not necessarily be public leaders. And so just even understanding the larger public interest in knowing how they are making decisions that can impact the larger community, I think has just been a learning process for all of them. And so, these are challenges that citizens continue to share with us as bills are moving through the session. Everything started last year from even knowing who was behind the process to now what services are being presented. There have been some changes that have been shared in the legislative committees that weren't necessarily shared with the public in their feasibility studies that they've shared. So there has been some concern, and reasonably so, from citizens to get that information out. And so even though I know there's a legislative process for how these matters are considered, perhaps there is some way that there can be some public sharing or notice provision in some future code as citihoods movements are considered, so that they can ensure that the public is getting information, because that's something that we cannot require at the local level.
Representative Oliver, I'll jump to you and see if you have any perspectives on how transparency is interacting with the cityhood initiatives this year.
I've been a part of the cityhood movement in DeKalb County since the creation of Sandy Springs and Dunwoody in the mid-2000s. And it is a very complex and, in fact, grassroots political conflict, neighbor versus neighbor. How do they wish to be governed? It's very interesting to me to measure, if we try to do so in the early stages, what's the effectiveness of the cityhood in delivering services. Brookhaven, Chamblee, Atlanta, and Decatur are all parts of my district, all of which have been subject one way or another to annexation and cityhood. Brookhaven is a good example of a successful city with a gift of geography and tremendous amount of economic development opportunities that are in conflict as they mature and go forward. The litigation between Brookhaven and DeKalb County, the litigation between City of Atlanta and DeKalb County school system, all has arisen in my district. It's expensive, it's time consuming, it is not the best way to deal with disputes. I've been a member of the Annexation and Cityhood Study Committee all summer and fall, chaired by Victor Anderson. We're going to have legislation coming forward from study committee recommendations. And independently of those bills that I'm happy to sign, I have introduced 3 bills in relation to development authorities and how they interact with annexations. I ask your folks to look at House Bill 66, 923, and 924. Here's the policy question and the transparency question. When am I, as a taxpayer, or I, as a General Assembly member, entitled to know what deal Brookhaven and some urban developer, suburban developer have reached in relation to tax abatements, which nowhere in the state code are defined in any way? When am I entitled to know about that deal that affects my county and my city and my school system budget and distribution of tax money?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think we're going to touch more on some of the development stuff and that issue of citizens' right to know versus the economic interests at play is always a hot button issue. Representative Jones, I believe you've been working with the Buckhead City movement this year. Do you have any thoughts about the cityhood initiatives and transparency in that process as it moves through the legislature?
Yeah, I think I want to just add on to what Chair Cupid said and also what Chairwoman Oliver said. A couple of things that run through my mind are the entities that are established, either pro or con, against the idea of the city. There's not a tremendous amount of transparency around those committees. And again, that's not a political statement, it's just the truth. We don't have that transparency. And I think it'd be important to get transparency, very similar to the way that Chairwoman Oliver and I, we have certain disclosure requirements here at the General Assembly, and we do expect our constituents to look at that, and that's perfectly fine. I think that would be at least a step in the right direction. The second thing around transparency, Chairwoman Oliver mentioned the process around the municipal creation, but I carried a city bill in 17 and 18 when I first came into the General Assembly, and I took a completely what I've been told is a very unique approach. The first thing was basically creating a committee inside of the county that effectively had open meetings. I asked the 5 BOC members and the 7 members of the state delegation to literally appoint citizens from their areas to come onto this committee, and it turned out there was 3 people from within what would have been the city and 9 people outside. I won't go into full detail because we have only 45 minutes, but we ended up having 1 full year of open meetings, literally where people could come in and not just give their feedback, but we also heard from different experts. May they be bond experts, may they be municipal experts, infrastructure experts, you name it. And of course, there was the feasibility study that was done, and there was a meeting on that. What was interesting coming out of that committee was not only did I give them the power of whether or not we definitely go to referendum, but we decided to make the threshold to create the city at 57.5%. First time to my knowledge since we were founded in 1776 that it wasn't 50% plus 1. I think if you're going to create, I'll say, a major change, in my mind, we're talking lung, heart, brain transplant, then we should have it at such a threshold that it's a mandate as opposed to 50% plus 1. Again, that's just my belief, but I think you create greater transparency, and then you also create an opportunity for all citizens to talk about the self-determination that they have, which is their governance. So hopefully that gives you a little bit of color.
If I could follow up just one request, is Bill White registered as a lobbyist at the Georgia General Assembly where he was yesterday? And is there any legal requirement that the pro-Buckhead city movement disclose anything at this point in time so I can understand who's funding this? Is Bill White a registered lobbyist or not?
Chairman Oliver, I don't know that answer, so I'm sure we can find out on the registry, as you know. But I think you're right. I think the pro Buckhead group, and I'll say I think it's called Atlanta United, United Atlanta group, which are, quote, the con Buckhead group. I think both of them live in very much behind the curtain as opposed to in front of the curtain. So I would say it not so much should pro have disclosure. I think, quote, the con side should also have disclosure. And I think that would be, I think, a good thing for everybody.
Todd, I would love to learn more about the process that you had when contemplating the cityhood measure.
Sure. We actually drafted a whole report, which, trust me, you probably don't want to go into. It's 60 pages, but we have an executive summary that's about 7 pages. I can send you the full and the short. I'll get your email from the folks here, and I'll send it across to you. And if there's anything that I can do, please let me know.
Great. It might be a model.
Well, Representative Oliver, you had mentioned economic development activities, and I had that further down on my list, but let's just jump there now. And I'll use the some of the Stonecrest Development Authority story as a jumping off point, because we've seen some troubling reports in the last couple of weeks about that development authority not keeping any records that are required by the Open Meetings and Open Records Act related to a $700 million bond deal from 2019. This seems like an extreme case, but it really does highlight the transparency problems that can arise when public officials don't keep the records that they're meant to, as well as the importance of transparency and the availability of records when we are talking about development authorities with these really large economic incentives and bond deals. Chairwoman Cupid, in your view, are these issues like we're seeing in Stonecrest, is that an outlier? What have you seen on the ground regarding development authorities, economic incentives, and transparency issues in Cobb County?
I can share that I am not aware of us having these issues in Cobb County. After looking at the Stonecrest matter just recently, I just want to make sure that we are doing everything we can to publicize when we're having meetings, ensure that our county clerk is taking notes. But for most of our boards and authorities, if not all, we have a staff liaison that is typically responsible for ensuring some of these requirements are met. But I have not delved specifically into our development authority. So that's something that I've been prompted to do in contemplation of what happened in Stonecrest.
Absolutely. On the question
I met with the development authority.
Yeah.
Forgive me, I'm sorry. I met with the development authority group, professional group this week, and I asked them, where is the $750 million? Where is it? And I don't have an answer to that yet, but I'm interested in an answer to that question. There are over 500 development authorities in Georgia. There are probably 20 in DeKalb County. To whom are they accountable? How are they governed independently by any elected entity? And as I, as an elected entity, entitled to know all the deals that a Brookhaven Development Authority that I created legislatively with local legislation, when am I entitled to know what deals they are negotiating or have accomplished? And the only statutory requirement, I believe, that exists in Georgia law is a legal notice in the newspaper of a bond validation hearing. And not even at the bond validation hearing is the judge obligated to say, what's the deal here? Where's the money going? Who's benefiting? I think there's a huge amount of work to do in this area.
Representative Jones, if you want to jump in, I'll let you. And I do have a follow-up to you, Chairwoman Cupid, but Representative Jones, if you want to jump in, please do.
I don't have a lot of substantive information to add to that particular point, so I'm just going to let it stand.
Fair enough. Chairwoman Cupid, on the slightly different question, but as we think about economic incentives and more not necessarily development authorities, but more general economic issues that the commission might be working on, how do you think about it as someone a little bit closer to the ground than in the state capitol? How do you think about the balance between letting folks know about economic deals that are happening and things behind the scene versus the need to keep deals as secret as one can to avoid competition? That's sort of the typical line that reporters often get and come talk to the First Amendment Foundation about those issues. So how do you think about that in your position as chair of the commission? Oh, Lisa, you're muted. I'm sorry.
Thank you. You mentioned the word balance, and there are interests to consider on both sides, not only the competitive interest, but also what it would do internally to that organization should persons that work for that company or do business with that company know of any shifts that company may be making. However, I certainly am supportive and have been an advocate for this information to be at the very least not just shared with the chair of our organization, but with all, or excuse me, but with the district commissioner and to all of the commissioners. So at least in Cobb, we had a process where just the chair would send a letter to whatever organization, it might be our development authority, is providing those incentives. And I've pushed for the district commissioner to be included before that letter is drafted, and also for that to be weighed by all of our commissioners. As far as public impact, you know, I can't say that there's a magic moment when the public should know. I think that may vary based off on the amount of impact, the amount of investment that's being made in that deal. Before any incentive is actually moved forward, there is going to be a public vote on that matter. So there always is the ability, as that gets published in our agenda and between the vote, to have public discourse. But I have found whenever commissioners have had questions that we've taken time to make sure that those are explained. And certainly I think if the public were to have questions, it will prompt a commissioner to ask questions as well, so that we can have some understanding of what's going on. That doesn't necessarily, there'll be 100% agreement on that incentive, but I can't perceive when we are getting ready to make that decision and offer funds, why we are not ensuring that all of the decision makers at the table have the same amount of information before putting that forward.
All right. Thank you for that perspective. That's interesting. I want to jump to another hot topic, both in Georgia and across the country, which is education policy and school curriculums. Senate Bill 226 is one example, one such bill. It would require school boards to create a complaint process to allow parents to report materials used in schools that they deem harmful to minors. The bill defines harmful to minors by borrowing some language from Supreme Court cases about obscene materials, and obscenity is something that the government is free to regulate without violating the First Amendment. The bill would require school principals to investigate any parent complaint within a week of receiving it, and then they would have another 3 days to decide whether to remove that content from the school. The bill also allows parents to appeal that decision up to the local school board, which would then have 30 days to act on that appeal. And if the principal and district determine that the complained of material is not harmful to minors, there's a requirement in the bill that they publicly post that content on the school board's website. Representative Oliver, what are the potential impact of bills like this in our schools? And if you have a perspective, given that it's trying to track the test for obscene materials, which we know we can regulate, and that's been around for decades, are there any problems that you see in the bill despite it trying to track that pre-existing test?
One of the reasons I am so happy and privileged to be a part of this mental health reform legislation, House Bill 1013, that's 74 pages, is it's a substantive, concrete set of issues to help people who are suffering and who need help. It is not a message bill. It's not a look at me bill. It's not a let me get the attention of somebody bill. Let me do politics bill. And I've had a long political career, and I am more and more impatient with culture war legislation. It doesn't help anybody. What it will do is create greater chaos and greater conflict for the school principal and the school librarian. We all have our favorite librarian stories as a child growing up. That is simply not necessary. The other side of that, which is, I think, Speaker Ralston spoke very thoughtfully about, is that people do need to be heard. And as they're upset and angry and stressed under all of the things that they're facing as parents, particularly of young children during this pandemic, people do need to be heard. But I try to be very careful about how I use my time as a political figure. And I don't think any of the culture wars, particularly when you start talking about pornography and whether children can read Beloved by Toni Morrison, is something that I think is helpful to people. How are school board members going to allow parents to be heard, to participate in the way that they already do in a wide variety of ways, and be effective in supportive and part of their children's education? It's not through these kinds of bills that try to define pornography and try to put teachers, or my favorite again, school librarian, on trial in some way.
Representative Jones, do you have a perspective on bills like Senate Bill 226 or some of the other education related bills that I think we'll see this session? And do you think that laws like this might have a chilling effect on teachers and school librarians as they think about the materials to give to students? What's your take on these bills?
I have a slightly different take than Chairwoman Oliver. To me, look, I've been in public education for 20 plus years. My mentor told me very, very simply, put the child at the center of every decision you make, and you're pretty much going to be right where you need to be. At the same time, though, I do think parents do have an obligation, and frankly, they want to have a say in terms of what's being taught. But Chairman Oliver, I think, brings up a good point. You have to be able to thread that needle appropriately. You have to create a system such that it doesn't overburden the school system, but one that does provide for an avenue for this type of objection to occur. And I'm really taken aback. I have 4 children, been blessed with 4 children. My second child's about to graduate from the University of Florida, my alma mater. And he said to me, and I quote, "I haven't written anything since 8th grade that I actually believe." Think about that. He wrote to what he thought his teacher needed to hear or his professor wanted to hear versus what he really felt. We can't have that. Critical thinking requires it necessitates both sides to be equally presented to our children, to teach them critical thinking skills, and then let them basically start to mature into the adults we want them to be. So for me, if this can be done in such a way that it does not create such an administrative task or burden, but does provide a way to do it properly, then I'm all for it. Because after hearing that from my son, that was a jaw-dropping moment for me. I don't want that to happen again. And for me, I think the only way we can do it is to ensure that, quote, both sides of every issue, may it be something as innocuous as A and B, or something as, I'll say, partisan even, as C and D, it still needs to be presented, because our children shouldn't be sheltered from it, but rather need to have both sides. And I think having the parents involved will, I think, promote both sides to be done and also help our children to become more critical thinkers. And I think that's what we want them to be, not what my second son, unfortunately, disappointingly has become, which is, I'm just going to write to what I think the audience needs.
Chairwoman Cupid, it seems like education issues have been bubbling up at everywhere in the last couple of months. What are you seeing in Cobb, and what's your perspective on these debates impacting freedom of expression and the availability of materials on all different topics to students?
Certainly, there is a lot of varied opinion about education right now, and I'll speak more as a layperson, as a parent, that when you have a large public body that you're serving or educating in a large body of parents, there's going to be varied opinion on everything. And there are a lot of things that I may agree with. There are some things that I don't. I perceive that I have the ability to reach out to my children's teachers, the school administration, through current avenues. So I'm just curious to know why there needs to be a more specified avenue to have this matter addressed. and why this versus any other matter that's touching our children, beyond this material. Is there a way to facilitate a conversation with the teacher? I'm a parent that's homeschooled my teacher. So, my children for about 3 years. So what they learn is pretty sensitive to me, and I'm very engaged in their education. But I also recognize right now I have a partnership with my children's school to be engaged. And I don't perceive, just on my end, not having the ability to share concerns and issues with my parents, with my children's teachers, for them to take that seriously and to consider that as they're educating them. So, if this bill is needed to make sure that that happens, then I can see why it should move forward. But I just have some curiosity about why constrain it to this one impact to our children when there's so many things that impact them on a day-to-day basis that also are deserving of attention.
Anybody else want to respond to that, or any other thoughts on the education topic that y'all would like to share? Well, I'm going to move next to a perennial favorite hobby horse of the First Amendment Foundation, which is Open Records Act and the legislature. We have some great transparency laws in Georgia, the Open Records Act and the Open Meetings Act, that the First Amendment Foundation is very proud of. They're very robust. One problem as we see it is that the legislature has exempted itself from those laws. Representative Oliver, do you think the Open Records Act should apply to the legislature? And do you see any path to that happening?
I don't think I see a path to that happening. I haven't heard discussion extensively about it. So I look at the Georgia General Assembly, and I don't know how many other states include legislatures and open records. Most of us, I think I've always estimated 60% have other real jobs. 10 to 15% are retired, and other folks, another maybe 10 to 15% are supported by family in one way or another, where they don't have to go out and have a real job. In my email stream is a mixture of personal things, law practice things, and political things. And as our social media expands, which of course didn't exist at all when I began politics, I think it gets a little bit more confusing to me. How would this is a question I ask myself, how would I conduct myself in the multiple ways I communicate through the multiple different platforms I use if I believed everything was public record? And that's a fair question. And I don't have a very good answer for it.
Representative Jones, same question for you. Do you think that the Open Records Act should apply to the legislature, and do you see any path for that happening?
I think Representative Oliver hit it right on the nose. I think there's a line that unfortunately is just fuzzy. I literally have at any one time on this device, and I have 2 SIM cards in it, one for my personal cell phone, one for my legislative phone call, but literally everything is, you can't really separate my personal, my business, and then what I want to call the people's business. It's nearly impossible to do. And it'd be hard for me to manage all of that. I probably have to carry 3 different phones and then 3 different computers, et cetera. And I'm not saying that that's not important, but I always hearken back to the days of actual bipartisanship. And, I always want to imagine Tip O'Neill and President Reagan sitting down, Tip O'Neill drinking scotch, President Reagan not being a big drinker, but maybe a glass of bourbon. And imagine what were those discussions that helped our country move with a Republican president and a Democratic Congress. And we saw progress, whether or not you liked what happened in the 80s or not. The fact of the matter is you didn't see massive partisanship, and you saw that occurring. If they had to do that out in the public, would that have occurred? In other words, would the compromises between the speaker and the president, would that have occurred? And I like to bring it down to us in terms of a lot of the times when we're having those conversations, because of the fact, unlike with the Cobb board, which, pardon me, Chairman Cupid, I don't know if it's how many members, 5 or 7 or 9, it's not 180. There's 91 votes necessary to move something across the line in the House. rarely is there going to be a quote private conversation amongst 91 people that would effectively create that, other than the caucus meetings that we have. So I do think it's a line that I understand the need to be able to be transparent. I try to get everything out that I can in my newsletters, my social media, etc. But then there's also that challenge that Representative Oliver referred to, trying to cut the lines between all of our different lives that would make it nearly an administrative impossibility.
Well, given that administrative possibility question, Chairwoman Cupid, I'll move to you because I think the Open Records Act and the Open Meetings Act do apply to you. So what's your take on the administrability of dealing with open records?
It's very interesting to have these laws imposed upon those that can recognize the challenges they would have, but those challenges that they recognize and prefer not to have are being imposed upon us. We do carry multiple phones. We do have multiple laptops. A lot of us do work outside of our current jobs. A lot of us do want to have free-flowing conversations with those in our parties and those across the aisle. And so for me, it's a bit frustrating to share the same or to share similar sentiment or to have understanding of the challenge that our legislators would have, but to have to deal in this framework. And we deal in this framework because there is a push towards the public policy interest of sharing information. And so even though I recognize that there are different steps I have to take in how I operate, that there is a larger interest in the public's right to have information and to understand how decisions are being made. And so there, as we used the word before, there is a balance. And it will be helpful to know that our legislators recognize the challenges and perhaps help us to balance those things while we balance the issues of the public. And it's not in, I do recognize the issue, it's unlikely 91 will be getting together, but even our, there could be other interests, again, that I think are shared, and that there's no differentiation between if it's local government or if it's state government. We are all elected officials and we are all beholden to those that elect us.
If I may follow up just briefly, Cardi B won a big lawsuit this week. Good for her. $4 million damages against an irresponsible blogger. In my litigation practice, which is about maybe family and business and conflicts, estate conflicts, I tell my clients there's a 100% chance that evidence in your case is going to come from social media. Something you wrote, your son wrote. It's a 100% chance. We're in this transition right now, which I don't know which direction it's going to go, where the social media phenomena of our lives, where people ruin their entire political life, ruin their entire personal life based on something they said in social media, and the Cardi B kind of case of the public figure. We're in a transition, and how is my legislative interaction with constituents, much of which is about personal issues, going to help build up a set of guardrails or a set of understandings that we have? It's a big transition.
I can share this, and it's not necessarily in direct response, but it's related. I talked to you about the different devices that we have. I have different social media accounts because there is public discourse on your social media page about things that your elected body is contemplating. And so the page that I do use for governmental purposes, it's open for public discourse. And there have been issues about people having discourse on public matters on their private page or modifying participation, whose comments get to be seen and not seen on their public page. You're right, it has opened up a whole new world as to how we take in information and how that is considered to be open information for the public, and perhaps a worthy field for someone to explore. But I can tell you today that the same interests that are required of me in using the multiple devices and having open meetings, I also have to apply that in how I use social media. And I know local elected officials who have had lawsuits against them because they have blurred the lines.
Yeah, PSA, don't block anyone from your official accounts.
Yeah.
That will get you a lawsuit filed pretty quickly, in my experience. And I'll just get on my soapbox that the First Amendment Foundation would encourage the legislature to continue thinking through ways that they might apply the Open Records Act to themselves, limited ways that might work for you guys. I always think increased transparency is good, and we do have citizens who come to us and ask for why they can't get certain materials that were circulated to committees and things like that as easily as they might get them from something like the Cobb County Commission. So I'll continue to bring that issue up every time we have one of these events, and appreciate y'all's perspective on it. We only have a couple of minutes left. I wanted to touch really quickly on Senate Bill 171, which I think is another representative bill of some issues that are going to come up this session. That bill creates and increases some criminal penalties based on someone's presence at a protest or expressive activities. It includes some increased penalties for blocking highways and things like that, largely in response to what we saw in the summer of 2020 and a lot of the Black Lives Matter protests. Representative Oliver, do you expect bills like SB 171 to move this year? And what impact do you think that things like that have on Georgians' ability to engage in free speech and assembly?
Well, clearly, that's the kind of bill that would be litigated on a First Amendment set of principles. The security issues around the Capitol are interesting to me, the way in which we've spent money to make it more secure. And it's always kind of, when I question those kind of things, it's always based on Homeland Security. There's some federal mandate that we do something. Nikema Williams' arrest in the Capitol is before the Georgia Supreme Court right now. These are actions, interactions that are going to become First Amendment discussions in courtrooms. That's our process. That's how we decide the legality of these kind of statutes. The more, I've got many decades of litigation. It's inefficient, it's costly, it's not accessible by most Georgians, but it is the system by which we make some of these decisions on these difficult issues. We have a habit of enhancing penalties on criminal actions significantly as a way to communicate public policy. I don't know it's the best way to communicate new standards of public policy. Just enhance penalties.
And Representative Jones, we'll end with you. Any perspective that you can bring to Representative Oliver's comments and to bills like Senate Bill 171?
Yeah, I'll be frank with the group. I haven't had time to read 171 or put any type of, I'll say, mental effort into it just yet. It's sitting on the Senate side. And we've been hit with, obviously, the budget's coming up in terms of the revised budget that's due, which I sit on the Appropriations Committee, and then also with the mental health. And I want to stress, by the way, the mental health bill, and I know Chairman Oliver knows this, I think she'll appreciate this, it's also dealing with dual diagnosis. So it's mental health and it's drugs. So I just want to make sure, because I know so many people are titling it that way, and we understand that, but dual diagnosis is so important. I don't really have anything substantive in terms of 171. The only thing that comes out to my mind, just as I go into that conversation, if something is sent across from the Senate for us to determine, really comes down to, clearly, we want the right of free assembly. We want people to be able to protest or to support whatever it is that they're going to do. We want them to do that freely. We do not want them to feel as if there's a criminal penalty over their head, comma, hyphen, dash, whatever you'd like to say. Can we just find a way to do it safely? I always get concerned if someone is going out into a road. I just don't want that passion and that enthusiasm for whatever it is that they are supporting or they are protesting. I don't want that to become then a public safety issue. And how do we deal with that? And I agree with Chairman Oliver. Is it necessarily a criminal penalty? I don't know that. I haven't thought it through enough, but I know this. We do have some level of responsibility just to ensure that people have an ability to assemble, but at the same time, also we have an ability to make sure people are safe. I'll probably look to law enforcement and others like that who are smarter than me to figure out what's the way to thread that needle and really make sure that they have the opportunity to do that.
Always that balance. Well, we are out of time, so I want to thank everybody, each of our panelists, so much for your time this morning. We really appreciate the conversation. And thank you again to the First Amendment Foundation sponsors for supporting our mission throughout the year. I'm going to pass this over to Rahul Bali, who will be hosting the Atlanta Press Club's discussion this morning. And thank you everyone so much for your time.
Bye.
Thank you.
And good morning, everybody. I'm Rahul Bali of WABE Radio. Before we get going with our panel, I want to thank Sarah, Chairwoman Cupid, along with Chairs Jones and Oliver, and all the work that was done by the Georgia First Amendment Foundation and the work that they did. So this is the second portion of our event today. It's the Atlanta Press Club Reporters Roundtable for about the 2022 legislative session. Again, my name is Rahul Bali, politics reporter at WABE Radio. I also serve on the Atlanta Press Club board. So I want to introduce you to our great panel. It's Riley Bunch from Georgia Public Broadcasting. Good morning, Riley.
Good morning.
Dan Stanley Dunlap, Georgia reporter. Good morning.
Good morning to you as well.
And Patricia Murphy from the Atlanta Journal-Constitition. Good morning.
Good morning.
Yeah, Patricia and I are early risers. We see each other tweeting at like 5 in the morning, sometimes 4 in the morning, whenever we get going. So I do want to thank all of our sponsors, our board, and everybody who's joining us today. I see we've got a great audience. We are going to take some questions throughout this from our speakers and for our panelists. You can type them into the chat function here on Zoom. You can also obviously visit the atlantapressclub.org to learn about future events. We're just going to get right into it. Let's start with Stanley. Let's talk about voting legislation, kind of top of mind, especially with some of the polling we just saw come out. You've been reporting on legislation dealing with absentee ballots, drop boxes, non-citizen voting. You got all these lawsuits that are out there. Kind of take our audience, trying to narrow it down, kind of what are you following on the topic of voting?
So clearly last year was a pretty historic year as far as with the changes with SB 202, which, basically became a sweeping reform on the election law. And so far this year, we've seen, Senator Butch Miller attempt to get a non-citizens voting law passed, which ended up failing, and which is one of the few opportunities Democrats do have to kind of squash bills is when they are constitutional referendum and it requires 2/3 majority vote to get through the chamber. And that bill would have added language, a referendum that would have explicitly stated that non-citizens of Georgia and the US are not eligible to vote, which is already state law. So that appears not to be going anywhere. We've also seen Butch Miller propose to put an end to absentee drop boxes that became a popular method of voting in 2020 during the pandemic. We've seen his opponent, one of his opponents for lieutenant governor, Senator Burt Jones, propose switching from the touchscreen electronic system to giving the option to use paper ballots, which we've seen there's, lawsuits going back to 2017 about the vulnerability of the electronic machines and whether, the pushing to move to paper ballots instead of kind of relying on electronic machines. That's up. We've seen the Democrats also file a bill this week that it's more symbolic, which would basically reverse everything that's in SB 202. So we've got quite a bit that's going on even after last year. And last, of course, we still have the 8 federal lawsuits challenging everything from the absentee drop box restrictions that were added to the ID requirements for absentee ballots. They're still in play. And those are legal matters that are going to be playing out for many months and potentially years ahead.
Riley, Patricia, anybody want to jump in on that, or we can jump on to the next topic?
I can jump in if you want, Rahul.
Please do.
I would just add that I think that legislative leadership has been pretty clear that they're not really interested in kind of rehashing the 2020 election and making big sweeping changes like we saw last year. Both Speaker Ralston and Lieutenant Governor Duncan have said, you know, we don't want to relitigate the 2020 election. So a lot of these bills are coming from people that have kind of this eyeing statewide bigger candidacies. And I think that's important to remember when we're seeing what kind of election changes are being proposed.
Rahul, I'll add the one exception to that rule is Governor Brian Kemp. And when I say he's an exception to the rule, I asked him about more changes to election law. He is up, obviously, in a really tough primary against former Senator David Perdue. And he said, no, I'm good. I think we've done a really solid bill with SB 202. Anybody who says it's not strong enough is lying to you. Anybody who says it's voter suppression is lying to you. And I said, well, do you feel confident you're on the ballot? Do you feel confident in the law and how it would secure the ballot going forward for your own election? And he said, yes, I'm fully confident. So he's one statewide candidate in a primary who is not itching to get in and do many more changes.
Patricia, go ahead, Stanley.
And just one quick last point on that is we saw kind of some of the effects of the SB 202 that played out with the municipal elections this past year, but that'll be a much bigger test this year when we have the statewide primary in May, and then we move into the general election in November.
Patricia, let's move on to one of the first topics when we moved into 2022, and that's gun laws. That really was kind of one of the first big things for those of us either on the campaign trail or at the Capitol. Talk about, and maybe you could start with the governor and talking about where we're going with the possibly expansion of gun rights in Georgia.
Yeah, of course. So the reason that we heard about constitutional carry immediately, just as the year was getting started, was because Governor Kemp made it clear that this is really his top legislative priority. And he had a big event at a huge gun store, sort of a firing range. And that's where he announced that he wants to push forward for constitutional carry. That is also known by Democrats as permitless carry. It would tell Georgians that they do not need to require a permit, as they do right now. You need to have a permit to carry a weapon in Georgia. That would erase the need for that permit. And that is something that the NRA has wanted quite a bit for a long time. And they're pushing similar measures in multiple other states. There are bills in Indiana, Alabama, Florida. This is part of a coordinated effort to loosen gun laws nationwide. And Governor Kemp, it's not a new issue to him. He has been supportive of this really since his first campaign in 2018, but he made it really clear this year he wants to put his real sort of legislative heft behind it. That's had an enormous amount of pushback from Democrats. One of the first Democrats to criticize that idea is Stacey Abrams, obviously. She came forward and said that if the goal is to make people more safe, having looser gun restrictions is not the way to do it. So I think you have to start to look at the chances of this bill passing. In the Senate Republican caucus, I would say that is relatively uniform support for constitutional carry. We heard from Mike Dugan, the Senate leader, earlier this week that it's one of his top priorities. Butch Miller, President Pro Tem, has said it's one of his top priorities. And so I think it's going to have excellent chances getting through the Senate really quickly. The person really to watch, as always, in the Capitol is Speaker David Ralston. And he was asked about constitutional carry at the press conference as he was getting his legislative session started. And he said that he is not really wedded to the need for a license to carry a weapon, but he does have concerns about people with diagnosed mental illness or people whose families are concerned about them. He does have a worry about that and what would permitting do, or not requiring a permit and a background check with a mental health piece on it. What would that do? What would this legislation do to that barrier that's there right now? And so he said he'd want to see the details of any bill. He yesterday said that mental health care, mental health issues is his very top priority. And so I think that's where the friction is for this bill. It will be in the House, and it will be what happens for families, for judges, for anybody who has concerns about somebody with mental illness. If you don't need a permit to carry a gun, you don't need to apply and request one. And so that's, it could open up a lot of unintentional consequences that I think need to be grappled with.
Riley and Stanley, anything you guys want to add to that?
I can jump in. I think another interesting thread to pay attention to when we're watching these, these gun legislation move through the House and the Senate is this parallel of tackling crime in the city and statewide right now. How do lawmakers justify kind of this permitless carry when they're also trying to address this rise in violent crime that we're seeing everywhere? And I think that that's kind of something that they're going to have to wrestle with, and another thread to watch when we're talking about these gun pieces of legislation.
I think that's a great point. I've been really interested in the rhetoric behind this piece of legislation. Governor Kemp and another of other Republicans have said this is the way for Georgians to be safer because they can use these guns in self-defense. Why should you have to apply for a permit just to defend yourself and your family? And that's just light years away from the rhetoric we used to hear about sportsmen and hunting, and that would be the primary reason for somebody to have a weapon. I think another stumbling block for this is going to be the reaction to law enforcement. We have heard from law enforcement that they have a lot of concerns about pulling a permit for gun ownership and to be able to carry here in Georgia. And so I think we'll look to how law enforcement reacts to this. And to Riley's point, if they're worried about it, what does that do to public safety? And what's the messaging?
Stanley, anything you want to jump in here on this one?
I think Patricia and Raleigh hit the high points and important points for what to monitor with constitutional carry.
I do want to add one more thing. I do wonder if even if permitless carry goes away, is there still going to be a permit process if for nothing more than the ability, if you have reciprocity with another state, you may still need a permit. And also the idea of still having a permit when you're buying a gun in the federal background check. So I still think that in practice, there still may end up being a permit. We are taking everyone's questions in the chat Q&A windows. I do see a couple of questions real quick. The one thing looks like a question from the previous panel on the mental health bill. I'll make it really quick. When it comes to private insurance and also the public insurance, when it comes to healthcare, my understanding looking at the bill is it's enforcing federal laws on parity. We talked to John King, the insurance commissioner. He intends on enforcing those rules of getting what is called parity, which is mental health care, kind of on the same level as physical health care. That's going to be done through, again, the insurance commissioner's office on private health insurance and through the Department of Community Health on like Peach Care and Medicaid. So that's our understanding on those bills. We're going to see a lot more on those bills. Let's go to Riley. Riley, let's talk about education and books and what's in the library and what's in schools. Talk about some of those bills. One of them is we've already been seeing moving through this session.
Yeah, and I'm so excited I get to talk about this after the first panel. For those who were tuned into the first panel, we saw a little bit of a preview of kind of the education policy battles that we're going to see this session. And I think, education policy is one of those things where you see political battles play out in it quite frequently. And it's been highlighted, under the pandemic, the issue of masks in schools, the issue of virtual learning versus in-person learning. And we're seeing the kind of those culture wars play out in bills this session. And there's three specific ones I want to mention. And the first is that obscene materials bill that we heard about from the first panel, which gives, supporters of this bill kind of label it as a quote parental bill of rights, giving parents a little bit more control over what their kids are learning in the classrooms. And we saw this bill actually last session as well. And the concerns that were brought up are the same concerns that we're hearing now, is that it creates this complaint process and kind of, these negative repercussions for librarians and teachers. So that's one of the bills we're seeing. Another one, is the one that everyone knows about is critical race theory, bills that are targeting critical race theory. And I think it's really important to mention that this is not taught in Georgia schools, right? This is kind of, some people have called it a issue in search of a problem, right? And we saw this in the legislation that dropped, I believe it was this week, is that they have to define critical race theory in the legislation. That's how kind of obscure this thought process is. But it's another one of those bills that we're seeing pushed by members of the majority, right? Kind of this culture war bill that's playing out in education. And the last one that I wanted to kind of flag for everyone that popped up yesterday is another bill from another session, and it has to do with free speech zones on college campuses. And this went through committee yesterday that I did not know this bill was coming back, so it was kind of a surprise for me, but it creates these designated speech zones for students on college campuses. So, you know, critics of this bill would say that it's limiting First Amendment right to gather where you want and, you know, protest and speak your mind where you want. So that's definitely another one to watch in the session this year.
Patricia and Stanley, anything you guys want to add in on that?
I think that Riley really hit the nail on the head with critical race theory. The need to define it, I think, really shows the reality that critical race theory, sort of whatever you want it to be in this political debate, it really is a political conversation rather than anything that exists specifically. You have to know what something is in order to ban it. And so when you get into the need to define it, a lot of people don't agree on the definition that is outlined in that bill. And so it's a very dicey proposition of actually passing a law to ban something that some lawmakers say, well, it's not a topic, it's not actually a curriculum, but it's a lens, like it's how you see things. Well, what does that mean? You can't ban a law on a lens. You can't ban a lens with a law. So I think it may serve its purpose as a political debate and maybe even a loose piece of legislation, but how it would be implemented or whether it would be caught up in the courts, I think that would be the really big question. I think it has a lot to do with the fact that it's 2022 and we have an election coming up.
The interesting thing going through, so one of the CRT bills out there is Senate Bill 377 from State Senator Bo Hatchett. That was the bill he presented when the state Republican caucus met. And he talked about the bill there. He's also a governor's floor leader. We know the governor has talked about these topics as well. So this is a bill I'm going to be following. And he does try to lay out what would be covered under this bill. Something interesting I found is there was actually specific language in the bill saying effectively this doesn't ban the teaching of slavery and segregation. So it's I'm trying to figure out what those standards are when it comes to that. So that's something. And another interesting conversation on this topic is, how do you enforce it? Is it through the principals? Is it through the school boards? Is it if a school system does teach CRT or they believe it teaches, who makes that decision? The state school board. And how's it enforced? Is it enforced through taking money out of the state funding formula, QBE? Or there's another bill out there that says if it's taught in your school, you can go to your school board and ask for some portion of your property taxes back. So that's also an interesting discussion that I'm kind of watching on this. Anybody else with some final thoughts before we try to keep moving? We've covered a lot here in just 20 minutes. I want to keep covering stuff. Anything else on this one?
Rahul, I just think a quick question is, who reports the violation of CRT? Is it an 8th grader? Is it a 3rd grader? Who reports it? Is that enforceable? I think it just opens up getting into that level of curriculum when there is not an agreed upon definition of what they're even trying to ban or why it's being banned. I think would be extremely problematic in an actual law.
Let's move on to a topic for the people who are not in politics, but who know that what I do for a living. The most common question I'm getting is Buckhead City. I live in Brookhaven, but obviously know people who live in Atlanta or around Atlanta. And when it's like the non-political circles, I get a lot of Buckhead questions. So Stanley, let's start with you on this one. Where do we kind of stand? Where does the legislature stand on Buckhead City?
Well, interestingly, Alpharetta Republican Senator Brandon Beach filed a bill for the creation of the city of Buckhead, and it was pretty quickly shut down by Lieutenant Governor Duncan, who assigned the bill to the only committee that's chaired by a Democrat. And so if anybody follows Georgia legislature knows that the committee chairs are the gatekeepers and control what bills or legislation then are presented to the committee, which would then determine what goes before the full chamber. And so that put it into that, but that doesn't mean that this topic is done with on the legislature side, because the language could get added to another measure that could then go before a different committee and we could see it introduced. And even though we've seen it pretty split, or maybe even more people who are opposed to it within the city of Buckhead, that will be the city of Buckhead or Atlanta residents, I don't think we're anywhere close to the end of this. So it'll be interesting. We know that Lieutenant Governor Duncan isn't. We haven't heard Speaker Ralston or Governor Kemp say one way or the other whether they support it. But there's enough movement and enough Republicans, lawmakers that are behind it that we probably will see something else come up this session in regards to that. And as the panel before us spoke, there are plenty of challenges that would have to be worked out, but I think we're far from seeing the end of the push and the movement to create the city of Buckhead.
Patricia, you've done a lot of reporting on this. Love to hear thoughts you'd want to add.
I think that a number of Republicans were in a wait and see mode until it was decided who the new mayor of Atlanta would be and how that new mayor of Atlanta addressed the Buckhead City question. And I think that Andre Dickens has really done a lot to take the momentum out of this movement. It doesn't mean that it's over, but I think that the fact that Dickens went to Buckhead the next day after he was elected, the fact that he announced that there would be a new police precinct in Buckhead, and the fact that he called Speaker Ralston at 7 o'clock in the morning on the day after his own election and just started this significant outreach to all of the leaders in the state capitol. And Mayor Dickens' primary concern is stopping Buckhead City, stopping the referendum. I think there are also a ton of details in this legislation that create problems for the Buckhead City group that have just not been addressed at all ever. What happens to the kids who go to Atlanta public schools in Buckhead? What happens to the bond obligations in the city of Buckhead if it splits away from Atlanta? None of those questions have been answered, even though they've been asked repeatedly. I know this will continue to go on as an issue, though, because Bill White announced earlier this week that he is starting a PAC, and the PAC will run candidates in 2022 who would be pro Buckhead City. If that is an indication that this is a long-term effort for him. But I actually live in Buckhead. I can tell you anecdotally, the focus of this has really become on Bill White and a lot less about the issue itself, as Andre Dickens has come in and made himself a really constant presence in the neighborhood. I think that the mailers that come to people's mailboxes are about Bill White. They're about his background, about his efforts to do this, about the questions he hasn't answered. And so that's not where you want this to be if you're somebody who wants to see a Buckhead City. And I think it's, as time has gone on, the momentum feels like it has slowed pretty significantly.
The conversations that I'm having with lawmakers, both on the record and off the record, are very interesting on this one. And it's, number one, what Patricia said. Andre Dickens is making both a very public and a very private push. The number of Republicans at the State House who've told me they privately met with Dickens, really, it surprised me. He is making a big push. So behind the scenes, you hear a couple of things from Republicans. We obviously, you guys had the op-ed in the AJC where Dave Belton was one of the first Republicans to publicly come out against it. He's a state representative from the Lake Oconee area. Republicans are saying a couple of things when we talk to them, just conversations in the hall. Andre Dickens should be probably given some time since he just got into office to solve crime. Number two, I've heard from some of my cities that they're not on board with this. Number three, some of them just said, why do I benefit as a Republican for voting for this? And then the last thing is, this is really starting to feel like the Atlanta airport takeover, where it gets a big bang in the beginning, starts slowing down, questions start getting asked, and maybe we're headed towards a non-legislative solution where some deal is made where some people are made happy, some people are not, but nothing legislatively, including a referendum, happens. That's just the feel from day in and day out conversations that I'm having down there. Riley or Stanley, did you guys want to throw anything to wrap this up?
Sure. On the point with Mayor Dickens, who is, plans to open up a new police precinct in Buckhead, plans to hire more officers. So he's kind of taking a more direct approach to dealing with, the concerns about crime. But also, I think it was kind of telling before the session when Lieutenant Governor Duncan was asked about it, and he essentially said that they think that just creating a new city is, you can wave the magic wand and all of a sudden the problem's going to be solved. That's not correct. And so you mentioned some of the the Republicans that have questions about that. I thought that was a pretty telling comment from the Lieutenant Governor.
Riley, anything you wanted to add?
Yeah, just one really quick thing, as I know this is such an Atlanta issue, but it also has repercussions statewide, right? So that's one of the things that is a concern for legislative leaders, is what kind of precedent does this set for people that have kind of these local issues, right? If there's a local disagreement, are they going to come to the legislature and say, oh, well, we're going to split off now? What kind of issue that I know the Georgia Municipal Association brought this up. And it's really something to think about, is how does this decision on this Atlanta issue ripple into other areas of the state?
And that word precedent is something we've heard from the House Speaker now a number of times on that. I do want to answer one of the questions from chat from Shanita. Where are these draft laws posted? They are on the General Assembly website. If you just put in either Georgia State House or Georgia State Senate, they'll pop up. In the upper right corner, there is a search engine and you can put in search words. I can throw a couple of bill numbers out there in case you're interested, but Senate Bill 370. Oh, the link is up in the chat if you want to see it. But Senate Bill 377 and House Bill 888 are the CRT bills that we were discussing, and then the bills on Buckhead are Senate Bill 324 and House Bill 858. So those are a couple of bills that we were talking about when you posted that. So want to keep moving on. State budget. Generally, when we start the session, one of the first sentences out of Speaker Ralston's mouth is, the most important thing we have to do is pass a budget, which is actually the one thing that they have to do. The budget year ends on July 1st, so they've got to get it knocked out during the session. Riley, a wealth of riches in this budget. Let's talk about that.
Well, I mean, what a unique budget year. So I've covered the General Assembly for 3 years now. And when I first came in, even prior to the pandemic, agencies were asked to make pretty significant cuts to their budgets, right? This was billed as kind of a longer term thing to save money on the long end. And this year, there's after, kind of record tax collections since mid 2020, we have this huge surplus. It's a $30.2 billion budget this year. It just seems kind of unheard of, right? And the rainy day fund is filled, to the brim. And after 2 years of cuts, it's good news for lawmakers. It's good news for legislative leaders and Governor Kemp. And I think it's important to remember that we have only seen Governor Kemp's budget proposal so far. The House and the Senate are still kind of ironing out their talks and appropriations. So some of the things that we have seen in Kemp's proposal are pretty significant. So we're seeing pay raises, the second installment of his teacher pay raise, and also a pay raise for school staff. That was expected. That was something he committed to during his campaign in 2018. And also a pay raise for state employees. We're seeing that as well. One of the other things that has to do with education is they're adding dollars back to the quality basic education formula, the QBE. They're restoring those funds that they cut out. This was something that lawmakers always touted that they fully funded, and then they made cuts during the pandemic. So restoring that. Another one of Kemp's kind of campaigny promises that he has included in his budget is this giant tax refund for Georgians, so about $1.6 billion in tax refunds. And this is all on top of things that legislative leaders would like too: more dollars toward mental health, more dollars toward the Georgia Bureau of Investigation crime labs, kind of tackle that backlog. So those are some of the big things that we know so far because of Kemp's proposals. But you know, we went through budget hearings last week, joint budget hearings, and a lot of the agencies, they really gave a dire picture of staff turnover. I think that's why a lot of people are in favor of these employee pay raises. So I think that's something we can pretty much expect in the budget.
Stanley, Patricia, so much to cover here. Any gems or other things that jump out at you?
Well, I've written about the $600 million to close 4 state prisons, and to use that money to open up a new one, to construct a new one and buy a private prison as well. And that's kind of, it didn't get as much attention as maybe it should, but that's a pretty significant, I think Kemp called it pretty, you know, kind of a milestone, historic allocation of money for the Department of Corrections. And that ties into, you know, a department that's dealing with high turnover, you know, a tough job. And there's been plenty of issues within the prison systems of how inmates have been treated, you know, the conditions inside there. And so, you know, some of the opponents or people that, you know, have had raised issues about how the treatment of prisoners has taken place in Georgia, point out that this may give you, you know, new buildings, but there's a lot more to problems that need to be resolved there before any real changes or significant changes can take place.
Patricia?
One other piece to budget conversation that we'll certainly hear is going to be an idea from lawmakers to have tax cuts, not just tax refunds. There is a proposal also to eliminate the state income tax. That's something that Senator David Perdue has proposed on the outside of the legislature, but it certainly puts pressure on the inside of the legislature with so much money kind of flowing into the state. And we do get those budget numbers from Governor Kemp's office week after week. And then every month we get the monthly revenue numbers, and the revenue numbers for Georgia seem to be just like up. It's a really good financial time for the state right now. And so for Republican lawmakers, I think we will hear a push for some permanent tax relief, not just tax refunds, but the concern always for somebody who runs a state that's required to balance its budget. You don't want to make permanent changes in a temporary budget environment. And so I think that will be the part of the debate that we hear going forward.
And on eliminating the state income tax, that's I've heard from a number of Republican lawmakers on the record, and I've posted some of those stories, my conversations with Speaker Ralston and Terry England, who's the chairman of appropriations. The budget's about $30 billion. I believe income tax and corporate tax brings in about $13 to $14 billion. How do you replace that hole? And is it a sales tax increase or return to cutting government? And I think that's a question that's going to be asked to those proponents or to candidates on the campaign trail. I want to jump back into the chat because we actually have 2 questions about Rivian. We had the big announcement on that. I think I can address the first one and the second one, and I'll also have you guys jump in because the Rivian announcement was massive. I mean, it was a big rollout. Actually, if you guys saw it, the state capitol, there was a Rivian outside the capitol, I think on Monday or Tuesday, that was just set up for people to sit inside. But do we see a return or revival of the direct sales ban on autos? That was, I believe, House Bill 460 last year. There's a bill sitting on my desk over here, Senate Bill 398, which may actually be also on that. So I think as big as Rivian, and I think the question was asked at the press conference as well, and no one really committed, but anybody want to jump in on this? Do you see kind of that idea of direct sale? You know, our family has bought a Tesla, and it's a quirky process. It's not exactly the same process as buying a Toyota Camry like we also have. So thoughts on that, anybody?
Yeah, I think the precedent has been set by Tesla, and it's hard for me to imagine. I have no reporting to back this up, but it's hard for me to imagine that Rivian would commit to this huge presence in Georgia and not have had casual conversations with lawmakers about making it possible to buy direct from the manufacturer. Although we all know that some of the most powerful people in any small town where these lawmakers are from are the car dealers. And Butch Miller himself is the car dealer, of course. So there would be a lot of pushback to this. Some of the biggest individual donors to some of the lawmakers are the car dealers. And so it would not be an easy lift, but I think it would not be possible.
And Riley, Stanley?
Oh, I'd love to hear your experience of purchasing the Tesla versus the traditional, car that I think most Georgians have gone through that process.
You really don't deal with a car salesperson. We basically, so for the car we have right now, we basically were taken to a computer to look at the inventory and how to change up the car. Because of COVID, we couldn't take a test drive, and probably because they were short on, there wasn't a ton of cars, but there wasn't really there's no negotiation. There wasn't really a haggling or looking at 10 cards. Really, honestly, what happened was we ended up sitting in front of a computer and just kind of looking through things. There were 2 cars to go sit in, but it feels different than. So we also got a new minivan. That was the process that I think most people have gone through. You sit in it, you talk to the person. Hey, what can we add? By the way, I find it very interesting that a spare tire is now an option. I know that's a quick detour, but a spare tire is not considered optional. Anyway, but it's a different experience. So, and I think that's what's here. And I kind of see where Patricia's going. That conversation had to be had. The other thing, local opposition to the Rivian plant. For those of you who don't know, I actually, before I went to WABE, I was at Oconee Radio Group. Morgan County was part of my coverage area. So I actually know some of those principals involved, kind of been following what's going on. They've raised a lot of money to oppose that plant. Can it derail it? Always, that's always possible. But this is such a massive investment for that area. They've already brought in the Facebook data center. There's a massive biopharmaceutical plant there. There could be, a battle between local officials in Morgan and Walton County versus the people who live there who want a certain life. And could you see people get knocked out of office? We saw that happen with the Braves. This could go kind of down that track of Braves going to Cobb County. It gets pushed through, forced through, and then some people maybe get knocked out of office. So I could absolutely see that happening. Anybody else want to jump in on any other Rivian thoughts, i.e., we had the First Amendment Foundation here. I think we're all looking forward to see what the incentives package looks like on this one.
Yeah, I think go ahead, Charlie.
I was just going to say very quickly, this is always the question of kind of the good of the state versus the good of the local area, right? Before I came to Atlanta, I worked in Boise, Idaho, which was booming at the time. And there was always opposition to the newest Amazon warehouse was, back there. But how much of a ripple effect does that have on an investment that is so big for the state? I would be skeptical about, if the local uproar is going to be enough to push back on such a big announcement.
Yeah, I think I agree. Although I'll say I was out in Morgan County fairly recently when I went out to the original Buckhead, Georgia, to talk to Dave Felton about Buckhead. It's just a beautiful part of the state. It's a lot of agriculture, a number of horse farms, cattle farms. And so it'll be more expensive for people to own that property if their property taxes go up. I think they are really struggling with infrastructure. In Buckhead, people drive through the little town to get to Lake Oconee, but it puts a lot of stress on their own local infrastructure. And so I think there'll need to be a lot of upgrades and incentives, and really thinking about the very significant effects it's going to have on people who, a lot of whom moved to that area because it's rural and because it's small towns and not a whole bunch of suburbs and strip malls. That's going to change. And so I think it will take a lot to help people adjust to that.
But again, and I'll wrap this up. I don't dismiss the idea that it could derail it or adjust it or change it, or there could be asked for more money or more resources, because again, Patricia's exactly right. I mean, people are going to have, I mean, even housing in that Jasper Morgan area could be a bit of a challenge if you really do bring in 7,000 workers. I know we've got about 5 minutes left, but I definitely want to get to the mental health bill that was talked about in the last panel. You had the two leading people. I also see a question about medical marijuana. We'll try to get that too. Let's talk about how large this announcement was. We don't see announcements like that often at the state capitol. I'll just start with Patricia. Patricia, just kind of walk us through the basics on the mental health legislation.
So it is a huge bill, 74 pages. It's from Speaker David Ralston, and Ralston has only introduced his own bill one time the entire time he's been Speaker. So this is his second individual piece of legislation. So it really shows how important it is to him. He said yesterday in the Capitol, it's the most important piece of legislation for him this year. And so I think we can see significant movement on it. It's got Democratic co-sponsor in there, Margaret Oliver, and Todd Jones, his own son, struggles quite a bit with mental health. He's taking the lead for the Republicans. For the bill itself, it has 5 parts. It's a sort of large omnibus effort. It deals with more resources to train more mental health workers so that we have more nurses and doctors and professionals in the mental health space. There's just a critical shortage in Georgia. It also gives first responders more support. A lot of times when a family is having a crisis, especially in rural Georgia, they call the sheriff, like they've got no one else to call. And the sheriffs have told Ralston they feel very ill-equipped to answer those calls on their own without more training and resources. It also provides parity with health insurance for all of your sort of traditional health needs. It requires there be that parity in the legislation, law, and enforcement to make sure that mental health gets the same kind of treatment. It doesn't keep people out because they have pre-existing conditions, for example. There are a couple of other pieces. There's a data piece so that people can measure really how severe the problem is in Georgia. We know the problem's bad and getting worse, but we don't have a lot of good data to measure that or to measure improvements. And so the bill would address that as well.
And I think the big thing people kept talking about was the parity thing, and the parity issue that you know, when you break your arm, you know, it gets fixed, and there's a whole process to it, but that people feel like that's not happening with mental health. And as I mentioned earlier in the panel, it's the idea that the insurance commissioner is going to use federal parity laws to enforce that. And I interviewed him yesterday, and he's saying that he believes that the insurance companies will be on board. Again, you know, people under Peach Care and Medicaid, which is people don't realize Medicaid is one of the biggest providers of pediatric mental health services. That's going to be under the Department of Community Health. And I think the other big thing that after the press conference, that when I started going through the bill, substance abuse is a very big part of this legislation. Substance abuse kind of, you know, almost intertwined in ways with mental health is really kind of built into this bill too. And let me tell you something. The other thing that I noticed, some of the most basic things are in this bill. The definitions of medical necessity, the definitions of substance abuse disorder, the definition of mental health disorder. There's some very granular, I'll give you one example of something very granular that's in there. If someone's having an issue, and Patricia's right, you call the sheriff's office. Right now, that law enforcement officer has to arrest the person before they can get them an emergency mental health evaluation. This bill would take that out. So the officer could just take you, wouldn't have to arrest you. You said 74 pages, a lot of granular details in here. Stanley, Riley, Patricia, you guys, anything else you want to add on that?
I can tell you.
Go ahead.
Oh no, Riley, you go ahead. I've already talked.
Riley.
I was just going to speak generally that, you know, the issue with mental health parity and how it is executed, the devil is in the details, right? You know, Insurance Commissioner John King said yesterday that he is going to enforce this, and insurers are going to be hit kind of with this tidal wave of new rules and regulations. And I would also point to another bill that addresses kind of this parity issue, and it's a bill that is not part of the omnibus bill, but it is a PTSD support for first responders, right? So that is giving first responders this parity level if they have a mental illness from an incident on the job versus a physical illness. And the issue with that bill is, how is workers' comp going to address that? You know, how does that drill down into the workers' compensation system? So I think that when lawmakers are thinking about these big mental health parity laws, they're going to have to get into the very nitty gritty of it to make sure it's actually enforced.
I want to answer a quick question that's in here about this. It says social worker students who are trying to pass licensure is costly. In the bill is a forgivable loan program for people training in those areas. Patricia, what did you want to wrap up with?
Oh, just a quick piece. Ralston tells this story somewhat frequently, that he was talking to somebody in South Georgia, and the person told him, somebody, a professional reporter said, you know, the only way I can get mental health treatment is it's easier to get arrested than to actually find somebody to help them get treatment. There is a path if you are in the criminal justice system, but there's not unless you're arrested. And so there's just a real mismatch in the unintended consequences and the number of people struggling with this right now. If families are in crisis, they can very frequently cannot get an inpatient bed, even if they do have health insurance. And so I think it's just a critical situation, and I think we'll see some movement on it.
We're a couple of minutes over. Let's just do a rapid fire, finish up and be done. Whether it's a final gem, something you're following, something you're doing today. Riley, what are you either doing today, or what's something that we may have left out here as we wrap up?
I saw this question in the chat, but medical marijuana, that is coming. I know that's going to be addressed this session, right? This process was in 2019. They started this entire process, and it's still dragging on. So, and there's a lot of frustrated people. So that is something that I will be watching.
Stanley.
Oh gosh, I'll be following along with covering the voting and election legislation that comes through, and working on kind of also what are some of the kind of the alignment that top Republicans in the Senate, House, or Governor and House Speaker Ralston have on certain issues, which when that happens, it's, you know, Republican controlled legislature, then those, you know, particular pieces will move through. And then what are some of the differences? And we kind of touched on concealed carry, but there are some nuances within that between, you know, that piece of potential legislation that would move through, where, you know, could be some interesting differences between the high-ranking officials.
Patricia.
Well, so I also cover the U.S. Congress. I have sort of a big bucket of things that I cover. So I'm keeping an eye on developments in Ukraine for a column I'm working on. But as far as the state capitol goes, I'll also be watching any legislation that deals with abortion, because the Georgia law is in court, and it's an election year. I expect to see anti-abortion legislation come forward. And so I'll be watching that carefully.
I want to actually wrap up with actually a question that was asked to me on social media, and it's gambling. I was wondering what was going to happen to this, and we had a great quote, kind of a marker laid down by Speaker Ralston, and that is basically, up to this point, everybody's been discussing, let's put horse racing on the ballot, or casino gambling on the ballot. Well, Speaker Ralston said, let's just take a different approach. Let's put everything on the ballot, and then let lawmakers figure out what to do. Just legalize everything. I've not seen that bill yet, but I'm going to keep an eye out for a bill like that, and see if that's what gets through, and then everything gets put on the ballot in November, and then lawmakers figure out what gambling looks like in the state of Georgia. Riley Bunch, Stanley Dunlap, Patricia Murphy, thank you so much. I'm Rahul Bali from WABE Radio. Thanks for supporting the work of the Atlanta Press Club. Thanks to our partners at the Georgia First Amendment Foundation. This event will be available to view online later. For more information about our organizations, you can check out gfaf.org for the Georgia First Amendment Foundation and atlantapressclub.org. Thanks, everybody. Thanks for joining us. I think all of us have got to run to the Capitol. So have a great day, everybody.